Good evening. Sorry. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Plymouth University. Welcome to the Roland Levinsky building, and welcome to this evening's CogTalk. We are in the gallery, and we have a sneak preview of an exhibition of, I forget what the title is. I've completely blanked on the title. Island Vernacular. So this will be opening on the 31st, but you can have a look this evening. Now, many people in the audience will drink coffee or tea. And some people drink coffee and tea because they find that it's stimulating, it wakes you up in the morning. Some people have energy drinks, such as Red Bull. Energy drinks are misnamed because they contain no particularly useful energy. You have plenty of energy in your livers. These drinks are stimulants. They contain caffeine. Some of you may also drink alcohol in the form of wine or beer. And these drinks are relaxing. So people drink substances which have mind-altering effects. And this is perfectly normal in our society. There's also a large class of drugs which are prohibited. These drugs may be used for medical purposes, but they're not allowed for general purpose. These include the narcotic analgesics. Finally, there's another class of drugs which are not illegal. Some of them are used for clinical purposes. And these drugs have so-called cognitive enhancing properties. And it is these drugs that we're going to be considering this evening. Now, just because a drug is dangerous doesn't mean that it should be banned. Alcohol is dangerous. Alcohol causes many road traffic accidents and road deaths, but we still allow alcohol. Yet, normally we assume that if something is dangerous, it should not be allowed. The question is, are these smart drugs safe for use? Are they useful? Or are they dangerous and should they be banned? There's a variety of opinions on this. And to help our understanding, we have two experts. On my left, we have Dr. Stephen Hall, who is Director of the Brain Stimulation Laboratory at Aston University. And, sorry, on my left, that's on your right. And on your left, my right, we have Professor Ruud Meulen, who is Professor of Bioethics at Bristol University. I'm going to start by asking Steve if he will explain what these smart drugs are and under what circumstances they might be useful. Stephen, over to you.
Good evening. Okay, so what I'd like to do, I'm sure you've all figured out the solution to this puzzle by now, but I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to this CogTalk debate. My name is Stephen Hall, and I'm a neuroscientist. So what I'd like to do is to tell you a little bit about how I think some of these things are working for cognitive enhancement. What I'd like to do is start with some of the simple things you might be more familiar with, things like brain training. So whether it's a word search or the Nintendo things that we're becoming more familiar with, how do these things work and how do they relate to more controversial things like drug use? And this raises the question of are there drugs that are more acceptable for use than others? So is coffee as acceptable as using amphetamines, for example? And when are these things okay to use? Okay, so in addition to this, we can use things like brain stimulation, even more invasive, so electrical or magnetic stimulation. And what are the relationships between these ways of modifying our brain activity and how do they improve our thinking? When is it okay to use these things? Just for brain disorders like dementia or for stroke, or for everybody? And then in adults, or is it okay in children? Are there times when it's more acceptable to use these things than others in an exam? Or is it always cheating? Okay, and this leads on to the broader question of the ethics, and I'm then going to hand over to Ruud to fill you in on the ins and outs of that side of things. So, as I said, I'm a neuroscientist, and this means that I do work that relates to understanding how the brain works. Now this, the most complex device in the known universe, works by each of these different aspects that you can see, each of these different areas, dealing with different functions. So the bit at the back of the brain with vision, a bit down the sides with your hearing, on the top your motor, and everything at the front with all of your thinking, all of your emotion. And in order for you to function properly, to do everything you do and be everything that you are, needs for the brain to be able to integrate all of these things. Okay? And the way that this works is that the brain is made up of these cells called neurons. And these are clustered together into local and bigger communities. And these then function by communicating with one another as an area, as for example the visual area, with other different areas. And the way that it does this is by firing, these neurons fire in specific rhythms. So if I can get you to imagine that each one of you is a neuron, and we are an area of the brain, of the cortex, the outside of the brain. If I can ask you to give me a round of applause. Thank you, got that out of the way. Okay, so what I'm talking about here is that if you're each firing, if you're each clapping in different times, that we end up with something that sounds a lot like a round of applause. Okay, if I can hand the microphone across a second, I'll ask for you to follow me this time. Great, thank you very much. Okay, so what we've done now is instead of us all firing randomly at all different times, we've produced a brain rhythm because we fired with some kind of periodicity, with some kind of synchronization with each other. And this is, it simply is the way that the brain performs this integration across different areas. Okay, and what we've done is we've made an oscillation, this brain rhythm, that happens at different frequencies. And so I got you to clap faster and faster. That was a faster and faster brain rhythm. And this is a simple way of explaining how the brain communicates and functions. And depending upon what these brain rhythms are doing, will depend upon how well your brain functions. So on to how we look at these things. We can use these very fancy looking brain imaging devices and look at different areas of the brain and see, I've got a pointer actually, but in the top right hand corner, this is one of these brain rhythms, and we can represent this with one of these simple graphs where along the bottom we've got how fast that brain rhythm is going, and up the side how much power there is in that, how loud your clapping would have been. Here we've got at 20 hertz, 20 times a second, the powerful brain rhythm you can see there. So I want to interfere with these things, if you like. So brain fitness or brain training is something that we're becoming more and more familiar with. The idea is that if you do something with your brain with a particular focus, then you'll improve. Okay, we're familiar with this. We go to school, we go to university, we train in different things. If you do something, you get better at it. So it's no real surprise that we're able to enhance brain function by doing things specifically. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that we can improve your brain age or the function of your brain by doing these specific tasks. And also evidence to suggest that we can prevent the onset of things like dementia with these brain training techniques. But effectively what we're doing is we're modifying that activity of the brain. When we compare this with the more controversial aspects, like using drugs, essentially what we're trying to do is to modify the brain and the way that it acts to achieve the same thing. So you might be familiar with this poster at the top right corner. This is for the film Limitless, where this guy had a drug that enabled him to have massive cognitive enhancement and do pretty much anything. Okay? So this is obviously the sci-fi version of what we're talking about. But a quick search on the internet, about 30 minutes, comes up with this list of drugs which are described as cognitive enhancers. Okay? Everything from coffee to amphetamines and legal and illegal in between. So I think I've just pointed out two here that I think Ruud is going to speak about in his talk. And these are drugs that are used for the treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, so mainly in children, where we're trying to improve their attention and reduce hyperactivity. And they're also used for things like narcolepsy, so involuntary sleep. But the controversial aspect is that there's a suggestion that these drugs might also enhance the cognitive abilities in control in healthy participants as well. This is the big question, because firstly we're not sure whether they do, and secondly we're not sure whether we should. But I think one of the interesting things about this is that it tends to relate to attention, and I've got a story that I'd like to share with you on some work that I've done. So this drug Zolpidem is a sleeping pill, and the question mark there is because of the outcome of the work that we've done. Now the news story about 1998, 1999 There was a young guy, had a motorcycle accident in South Africa, a guy called Louis, and he had major brain injury following this, and was in a persistent vegetative state, or a form of coma, and had been that way for about 2 years, I think. And one day his family came in to visit him and were concerned that he was a bit agitated, so they asked the clinician to prescribe a sleeping pill to calm him down. They gave him zolpidem, very low dose, I think more as a placebo for the family to reassure them than anything else. And half an hour later, this guy woke up, essentially, and was able to communicate with his family. And ever since then, this report was more than 10 years ago now, he's now functioning better and better, and is able to stay awake for a full day with one dose of this drug. And there's been many reports of this. It doesn't work in everybody, but it works in lots of people. And we followed this up because there was a report of improvements in stroke. And so what we found is that, or what had been reported is that there are improvements in cognitive function in people that suffered stroke and brain injury as a result. And so we wanted to understand what was actually happening. So we used our fancy brain scanning devices. First, we tested whether this was actually true. And you can see on the left-hand side here, in our participant, JP, he'd suffered a stroke about 6 years before, and was suffering problems with language. So one of the things, he had problems with category naming. So he would confuse a chair and a table. Or if he was asked to give you a word beginning with W, then he would find it very difficult, or at least he might be able to give you one, but then he would get stuck on that. And he also had problems with motor performance as well. So he would come and shake your hand, couldn't remember your name, shake your hand, and wouldn't be able to control that. So he's a vice-like grip that would crush every bone in your hand when you would shake his hand. So what we did was to give him zolpidem and to see what would happen. And sure enough, we found that there were improvements in his IQ right across the board, and there were improvements in his language function. And these, I won't go into the graphs below, but they're just representing the time course, with the blue line being the improvements. But at the top you can see the brain regions that were involved in this improvement in function. Okay. And if I take you back to, all right, raise one question. So if this has improved IQ in JP, will it improve IQ in you and I? Will it improve our ability to perform? And the answer is that if we look at what happens in his brain, we see that these brain rhythms that I was getting you to generate, we see that they are reduced. They were too high in the first place, so JP is on the left-hand side. And if we try this in our healthy control participants, we see completely the opposite. So effectively, the complete opposite thing is happening in somebody with a brain disorder, this brain disorder particularly, than is happening in our control participants. So, rather unexpectedly, no, it doesn't really help if you take zolpidem. It is a sleeping pill, and I've included this picture because once the first reports of improvements in IQ came out, lots of students decided that they would try this for their exams. And anecdotally, this was the result. Lots of students that were halfway through their exams and not going very well on question 2. Okay, so there are other ways of modifying brain function as well. I just wanted to play this. Hopefully the audio will work. But we've got things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, so where we can induce an electrical current in the areas of the brain that we're interested in modifying. And we can do this by using a big magnetic field, by, as you'll see here, a very big figure-of-8 coil that we put over the brain. And the idea is that the area of the brain that we stimulate, we will be able to modify function in that area. Okay, and I think this is a reasonably good example.
Bob, you any will. That's very good. It's reassuring to know that professors still know their nursery rhymes. Or you can choose anyone. Okay, I'm going to get you to repeat that, but this time I'm going to stimulate this part of your brain with your machine. Start, please.
Papa.
Okay, so not so good after he's got the brain stimulation. So it's a rather crude demonstration of what we're doing here, and this clearly is the opposite of cognitive enhancement. Okay, but the idea is that this technique and those like this technique are now being developed and put forward as ways in which we might improve cognitive function. We've done a study with this technique, a little bit more refined, I'd like to think, where we did some work. This is just a schematic on the left-hand side of the setup. And what we've done is to stimulate at a pattern frequency. So effectively doing what you've done and putting in an artificial brain rhythm. And this artificial brain rhythm is able to impair in some people and improve in others their ability to move. And so what you can see on the top right-hand side here is the excitability of the brain region that we've stimulated. And on the bottom right here, you can see the change in the rhythm. So you can see the change in the power of that rhythm that's associated with it. So what I'm telling you is that if we stimulate at a particular frequency, we can modify your behaviour. Those on the red line here also had an increased reaction time, so we can make them slower, or we can make them a bit faster. And that corresponds to these changes in the brain rhythms. Okay, so this is yet another way that we can do this cognitive enhancement or reduction, if you like. So I'll finish here and just sort of put forward some of these questions. In my personal opinion, I think that if we've got somebody that has an impairment through a brain disorder, any way in which we can improve that, any way in which we can improve the quality of life or performance for that person is fair game as far as I'm concerned. If we can find a drug that improves somebody's ability to perform after they've had a stroke, then I think that's something that we should be trying to achieve. And the same thing with the brain stimulation, although with a bit more refinement than I've shown you. Should we be using this in everybody? Why would we use it in adults? This is a big question. Obviously, we all want to be much smarter than we are. But if we do this, then when should we do it? Is it okay to do it during an exam? If I take a drug that makes me smarter in an exam, and I don't take it every other day of the week, then am I as good as I was during the exam? Should I be doing my job if I've had to take a drug to take the exam to do it? I'll hand over to Ruud to answer these questions in a minute. But one thing I am quite clear about is, particularly when it comes to things like brain stimulation, I certainly wouldn't be using this on children. The reason for that is that the brain in a child is very different to the brain in an adult. Okay, we've been to school, we've learned, and our brains have changed by all of the training and teaching that we've had. And so in order to interfere with that, we may be doing more harm in the long term than in the short term. So I think I'll leave it at that and say thank you very much and hand over.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. I think we've got a good picture of the basis for this area, and thank you for telling us about your research. Clearly, these drugs do have an effect on the brain, but it's not the only way in which we can affect the brain. But is it cheating? Is it right? Let's now turn to Professor Ruud Meulen, who's going to contribute his ideas.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, good evening, everybody. Sounds a bit strange name to you, but because I'm Dutch, it's my background. We'll all probably know Ruud van Nistelrooy and Ruud Gellert, so I'm the same let's say, first name. My talk is, should students or use smart drugs to improve their cognitive performance? I don't think so, to be honest. I don't think these drugs are effective in the first place, and secondly, they are very dangerous. Certainly the ones already mentioned by Stephen. So how do just down? Okay, just the outline of my presentation. Oh, I better sit down and no worries. So what is cognitive enhancement? Some cognitive enhancers, benefits and risks of the use of cognitive drugs. Is there a hype? I think there is an enormous hype going on these drugs. Is there support for the use of cognitive drugs? Yes, some support. Should we change the policy on the use of cognitive drugs? Should we, for example, test students? We take their urine samples before they do the exam or something like that. Should we allow the use of these drugs if they are safe and effective, maybe in a far, far future? Now let's start, what's cognitive enhancement? Because we often use the term enhancement. What do we mean? So nowadays we have a lot of biotechnologies, including pharmacological drugs, who are developed to heal people from severe diseases. For example, the thing Stephen is doing with stroke patients. But many of these technologies have the potential to be used beyond therapy as a way to improve what we call enhance normal human capacity. There was a report by the President's Commission for Bioethics in the United States, it was under President George Bush. It was a quite conservative report. It was called Beyond Therapy, and that's all about the use of drugs cosmetic surgery, etc., for human enhancement. Biotechnologies can help make people think better. That's what we're discussing tonight. To improve memory and perception, to feel happier. For example, think about the use of Prozac by people who are, what's the word is, well, let's say, just to feel better than well. So you're not really not really strongly depressed in a clinical sense, but a little bit. You don't feel well, you take some Prozac or Seroxat or another what's called SSRI, and you feel a bit more gentle, a bit more open, you feel happier. Is that okay? And there's a debate, in fact, are you not, let's say, feel better while you're actually using these drugs as goes against your own authenticity? You know, of course, physical skills and sport, doping. We have the example of Lance Armstrong very recently. Or let's say various technologies to extend the normal human lifespan. Well, there is a big hype going on there as well. So, what's the ethical debate? Very generally, and I will narrow down to cognitive works after this slide. So, there is a debate whether is it not changing our sense of self, our human nature? There is a new movement called post-humanism. We can change human capacities that we're, let's say, creating beings that actually we don't call human beings anymore because they have such, say, enhanced capacities or which are unimaginable with our current body and current mind. What's the impact on other life forms? And I think very, very interesting is the impact of enhancement technology, if they ever work. I don't think they work, on society and position of vulnerable groups, like for example people who are not enhanced or who are, let's say, struggling with disabilities. So what's the impact on those groups? How we create a kind of an underclass? And we don't. The whole debate on enhancement has the background of eugenics. I'm not going to discuss eugenics now tonight, but there is a kind of a bit of background there which makes these technologies a bit suspect. There's a concern whether enhancement is a good thing in itself, whether it may expose our life, our nature, and our society to irreversible death. So that's the general debate on human enhancement. People are very positive enhancement, particularly among some colleagues of mine at Oxford. I don't share their optimism. I think I'm actually quite worried, certainly about cognitive enhancement. So already mentioned, what drugs are we talking about? Modafinil or Provigil, used for sleep disorder, as Stephen mentioned, but they can promote vigilance, particularly after sleep deprivation. Adderall is an amphetamine, and to treat attention problems, also to improve vigilance, working memory and pulse control. Ritalin, well known because treatment of ADHD, there's attention deficit disorder, but can be used to promote spatial working memory, attention to specific tasks. Interesting, rivastigmine, donepezil are what's called cholinesterase inhibitors for treatment of cognitive problems and Alzheimer's disease, but can be used for memory improvement, so memory pills. And also to mention perhaps Prozac, Seroxat are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs. They are used for treatment of depression, but can also have some cognitive effects in terms of attention. So let's focus on the first three. Are the benefits? Well, there is increasing research, particularly in Germany, found that methylphenidate is Ritalin may improve memory, but there's no effect of other cognitive enhancing drugs. Adderall may improve functions in subjects with low IQ, but impairs functioning subjects with higher baseline performance. So if you're all going to university or work in university, don't use Adderall, those will in fact reduce your cognitive function. Improvement along cognitive domains, for example, short-term memory, are mostly associated with impairments in other domains, for example, long-term memory. Amphetamine, methylphenidate, modafinil improve primarily motivation and vigilance, and they're better called vigilance or motivation enhancers instead of cognitive enhancers. So I'm quite pessimistic and a bit negative. So what are the risks? And I think this is actually a big risk. That's the huge, it's come out to know, the huge addictive potential. They can lead to addiction, particularly modafinil, because what they do, they raise dopamine levels in the brain, and we often raise dopamine level in the brain by food, communication, and sex. About, let's say, that will raise 50 to 100% of dopamine. But these drugs raise dopamine levels by 175 to 1,000%. So that's a huge increase of dopamine. And because of this huge boost of dopamine, the brain wants it again and again and again, and at crazily high levels. Drugs have serious side effects like certainly amphetamine, heart and blood pressure problems, heart arrhythmia, headache, nervousness, insomnia, mental health problems, etc. And when they are used outside the medical context, for example, the work that Steve was doing in a medical context, okay, but if you're outside, it's very dangerous and risky, and certainly there's no control or monitoring by doctors. So, is the use of smart drugs widespread among students? There has been a publication in Nature some years ago, and it's seen as that's very often referred to and says that about 20% of the respondents, students, academics, were using drugs for cognitive enhancement. And that paper actually was highly inaccurate. It was not based on evidence, it was based about hearsay, or what other people say about other people. Studies among American students at 119 colleges found only 6.9% of students used them in their lifetime. And last month's pattern was only 2.1%. And often it's not clear whether they're using these drugs for cognitive performance during exams or just because for illicit use, just to have a lot of fun. Non-medical users are usually younger than 25 years, are often involved in other illicit drug use. Far lower percentages are found in studies among German students, 1.3% in lifetime and 0.06% in past months' use. So the prevalence of the use of these drugs is not as high as some newspapers and journals seem to suggest. The percentage also much higher. People are asked whether they know people using these drugs. 20%, 32%, and often our students have used smart drugs themselves. So reports in the media about widespread use of smart drugs are not true, not based on evidence, but I must say enthusiastic claims made by some bioethicists, I will not mention names here. German speakers speak of a phantom debate. It's not really a debate. Cognitive enhancement is in the media hype cycle and will follow the process of high disillusionment and enlightenment. That is what Boris Kretnow from Switzerland, is a German working in Zurich, is saying in one of his papers. So, question background, what's the role of pharmaceutical industry? I don't know. So, Australian, is there support for the use of cognitive enhancers? An Australian study found 7% of the members of the public supportive of these drugs as they went for non-medical use, but a much higher support for use these drugs for medical or psychiatric conditions. And Brad Partridge comes with this conclusion. German students are only positive if the drugs are safe and not leading to addiction. And I think that is a real risk. I think the use of drugs is more and more a kind of public health problem. And German students have a bit of an ambivalent attitude, but this may change if the pressure of these drugs to use these drugs increases. However, most students doubt, and there's an Australian study, doubt the effect of having drugs and think it's unfair to use them. Should we change the policy on these drugs? Tighter regulation, what is what Martin was saying, for example, using students to give urine samples before or after exams, will give these drugs actually a kind of an aura of effectiveness on exam performance. You've already seen the slide with Stephen. These drugs are not effective and they are dangerous, and you should not stimulate the use of these drugs, as some bioethicists irresponsibly argue. We should not stimulate these drugs because they are, for the same reason as we should not tighten the control, because they are ineffective and dangerous. And it's much better to promote stress relief, a balanced diet, good night's sleep, much better for your vigilance than partying all night, physical exercise, reduce substance use, and better working hours. So stay in the EU, I think they still have the working time directive. So if the use of cognitive drugs effective and safe, let's say effective and safe, should they be promoted? Now here comes the ethical argument, finally. They induce unfair advantages and promote cheating, like for example doping in sport. We all have our opinion on hard work. I don't think it's very positive from an ethical point of view. They promote what's called medicalization, increased dependency on drugs for human functioning, and higher workload. I think that's a very dangerous development. They give the wrong impression, and that's a more fundamental issue, that education has only to do with improving cognitive function. And I think education also to do with developing your personality, your social responsibility, your moral integrity, your maturity, your creative potential. And I don't think these are things that are promoted by the use of cognitive drugs. So this is all I would like to say. Thank you for listening, and now I'm happy to have a debate.
Well, thank you very much, Ruud. I think that's very clear. Ruud has presented the view that these drugs are not effective, that they're dangerous, and that there are several reasons why one should not encourage them, but at the same time that making them illegal might actually have that very effect which is going to encourage them. So now the debate is open to members of the audience. We have microphones ready, and who would like to start off? We've got a comment from back, comments or questions, whatever you like. Let's just have them come here.
Right, thank you. Obviously very surprised to hear you say that mind-enhancing drugs aren't the idea and we should have better food, better sleep, more focus, etc. But if they don't work, then where's the ethical consideration?
Thank you. Would you like to respond to that?
If they don't work, if the drugs don't work.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So if they don't work and if they can't provide if they're not mind enhancers, then surely there's no ethical debate about them, whether or not they should be used.
Well, the ethical thing is, first of all, that we should not promote these drugs, as some of my colleagues do, because I think that's not an ethical thing to do, because they are very dangerous and they lead to addiction. So that's an ethical issue, I would say. And there's also an ethical issue to put pressure on people to use these drugs, as some people do. And you can imagine, for example, in the military, where pilots are, let's say, pressured to use modafinil. And I say that's not unethical because modafinil keep them awake. And I think it's highly unethical to do this because there's a pressure to use drugs which are dangerous, which are addictive, in a situation where people are at work. So I think it's an unethical thing to do. The hypothetical situation that these drugs can be made, let's say there may be a drug in the future which is not addictive, which is not leading to headache and to heart rhythm problems, etc. In that hypothetical situation, I still don't think you should use them because that's where the ethical argument starts. And I still don't, just in that particular case, there is an ethical discussion. But I think at the moment, no, except that you should not promote them and you should not force people to use them.
Okay, we've got another one, I think, at the back first, and then we'll come to you over here, okay?
It seems to me that if cognitive enhancers actually work, then the ethical arguments against them centre on fairness and authenticity. And authenticity is entirely socially constructed. And fairness is, for something to be unfair, it means it has to be unequally distributed amongst this culture. So if we were sort of using a non-human perspective, say we were reviewing different civilizations throughout this region of the galaxy, and there was lots of authentic but fair cultures who hadn't enhanced their ability to perform, and then there's one human civilization that has basically souped themselves up through every technical means available, surely that is a much more successful race. And so the ethics there argue against the avoidance of these substances.
Yeah,
Okay, I'm going to ask Stephen to start by responding to this one.
I'd probably just ask a question back, following on from what Ruud said. Do you think Lance Armstrong is still a hero?
The only reason he's not a hero is because not every cyclist is on the same drugs.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's the level playing field question, and they all. I think these things come down to a kind of a cost benefit thing, in my opinion. So, we could agree that it's either okay or not that everybody takes a performance-enhancing drug for cycling or for everyday life. But it's down to what the negative aspects of that are. As we said, with lots of these drugs that exist, I mean, without inventing new ones which we'd like to exist, the fact is that they have a tolerance-inducing, so these have addictive properties. So there's a difficulty there, and the whole negative health aspects to this as well. So there's a cost to obviously addiction and potentially all of the other negative aspects that might come alongside this. In terms of using these things periodically, so is it okay to have an event? I mean, I'm pretty sure that Lance Armstrong doesn't use drugs for his commute to work on a daily basis. Probably takes it at a slightly slower pace. So my point is, if we use drugs for an exam, is it okay to just use it on that day? As I was saying, if I use drugs for an exam and I'm particularly smart on that day, but I don't use them every other day because I don't want to become tolerant, then there's an ethical debate probably around my performance generally as to whether I'm able to perform without drugs compared to on drugs.
Okay, Ruud, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's maybe something about authenticity. It's a difficult concept. There are various interpretations of what authenticity means, but there is a kind of a moral intuition that we think is more, let's say, come back to that argument, if we had won the Tour or 7 times without using drugs, it would be very clear, we would have much more admiration, because that's really authentic performance. There is a kind of an idea in our culture that, maybe you're right, is socially constructed, but that if we use technology, we don't think it's a really authentic performance. That technology is, let's say, suppressing your authenticity, that technology may in fact dominate your life. There's a very exaggerated argument. There's a kind of feeling that technology should not dominate our lives, we should express ourselves, we should put effort in reaching things. We have more, let's say, admiration for this than, for example, than when we use a pill to reach a certain, let's say, to achieve, let's say, an award, victory in sports or whatever. Is that a right argument? Is an argument from authenticity, is it right or wrong? I think some of these technologies, in fact, certainly if you look at the antidepressants, certainly can help people to lead a better life, to, let's say, to express their authenticity, certainly if they are blocked by depression, blocked by certain memories of the past. So I do not share the view that technologies are, and certainly pills, suppress, let's say, an authentic life, or not, that they're not leading to an authentic life. Certainly can help people, but if technology, but that's where is the fine line? Where is the use of technology leading to, let's say, to an inauthentic existence? And that's very difficult to say. And I don't have the answer there. I think it's very clear in sports that if people are using, let's say, EPO or let's say certain other drugs, then they are, let's say, using technology to achieve a higher performance. But where the fine line is, because they also use other kinds of technology, for example, better equipment, there's also a technology which also leads to a better performance. So where is the line between authentic and authenticity? So I don't have the answer now.
We've got one over here first, I think, is that right? Yes. And then
Hi there. I've heard the term ethics bandied around a few times.
Okay.
Here's an ethical point. Do we feel it's ethical that we children and young adults should be growing up thinking that intelligence or academic performance is the epitome of brilliance and intelligence and everything, when it's quite evidently not? We look at ADHD, I'm going to use the most blatant, obvious argument here. I've heard we using terms like smart people, blah, 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 intelligent people. ADHD, in contrast, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. An extension to disorder is the term disease. And I saw disease up on one of the slides just now. Disease suggests that it's signs and symptoms of an irregularity and we want to get rid of it. Well, that's ridiculous. the ADHD brain is actually wired slightly differently, okay? Mummies aren't happy with it, and daddies aren't, and school teachers aren't, because it doesn't fit the environment that they're in. They don't cater for the difference. You put a child who can't sit still in a classroom, and they're not going to perform very well. But what we do know about children with ADHD is they have an ability to hyper-focus, meaning that when something really grips them, they're in it, and they're hyper-focusing on to such a degree that we can't do that. And what I want to say to that is, we put children in a classroom, we medicate them on that because what we don't solve there is their feeling of inadequacy, or that because they're not academically performing, that they can't aspire to be a researcher or an academic. That child was me, and there was that. So there's a bit of subjectivity and objectivity. I didn't perform well at school. I came out afterwards, and then I found psychology. I did a degree. I struggled as an undergraduate. But afterwards, when I started generating my own research questions, I did really, really, really well, because it came from me. So one point there was about it being deficit, when it's actually different. I think you raised the point, Ruud, about saying that a benefit in something is going to have a trade-off, and it's going to take away from something else, some other function. And I think to feed that we need more of something is actually a delusion. Because if you look at learning disability, for instance, you would think that the problem in learning disability is having too few neurons or too few dendrites. When we know that in some cases that's the case. But actually, we also know that having too many is just as problematic. What seems to be the best point is having an optimal, where things run smoothly. So I think the idea of having too much of something is quite dangerous too.
Well, I'm going to ask both speakers to reply to the issue that this whole issue of smart drives overemphasizes the idea of smartness at the expense of other human characteristics, such as being a good person, for example. So we'll start with Stephen, and then we'll ask Ruud to both comment on that particular point.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I made the point that, and particularly referring to the last slide where I showed the brain stimulation in children, there are a few researchers that have gone down this route, and the idea of this is to try and improve learning in these students. So, and these are very young. I mean, you saw that the picture there. There's children that are between 5 and 10 years of age, and the idea is that you can stimulate in a particular way and improve this child's ability to learn something. The question there is, what's the trade-off? And I think I'm coming around to your point in a long-winded way, which is that if we are improving function in one way, are we disrupting function in another? And so, with reference to drugs, things like Ritalin, which are commonly used, we're quite familiar with these things and their use in children. I do think they're overprescribed, and I certainly don't think they should be the first line of defence. I'm not an expert in developmental disorders, whether we want to use the term disorders or not. What I would say is that I think there's a lot of evidence that they are prescribed too quickly, and that there are a lot of other avenues to improve, whether it's concentration on specific aspects or not. I think we're turning to drugs for children quite a bit too quickly, because we're not sure of all of the costs that are associated with that. And then this links into the other aspect, the point that you were making, which is that we're judging children on one aspect. They may not be able to sit down and perform, but we know that they'd be particularly good in other aspects. So yes, I think we should probably look at these things from a whole point of view, but we should also consider that society and education puts a structure over these whole things. Unless we want to change that, then we have to try and work within those bounds to some degree. So we want our children to be able to succeed as broadly as possible, but at the same time probably recognise that they are individuals and will be better at one thing than another. So I'm not sure if I've entirely answered your question at all, or just skirted around it.
Would you like to comment on
Yeah,
this?
I can only agree with what you're saying. Actually, there's a lot of pressure on intellectual performance, and I think that's rubbish, because you could lead a life that is very happy and good life without being a smart academic, even maybe a better chance to lead a happy life than being an academic. But there is a kind of let's say, I give you an example. If you know that the children, I know of friends who have a son who is very highly gifted, very high IQ, as over 160 or so. And the boy is suffering from depression a lot. that happens very often with children who are very highly gifted, very highly intellectual potential, often a lot of emotional problems. So if we pump in drugs into people to be a higher intelligence, what are the emotional effects? And so what's the effect, let's say, on their life to, let's say, to become a fully developed person, let's say also what's called social and emotional intelligence. Equally, some people deny that something exists like emotional intelligence. I think it's still an interesting issue, but drugs are now used to, the other thing is, you mentioned that drugs are used to treat everything. For example, ADHD. There is now a discussion about the drugs to cure shyness. Why is shyness a problem? I can be very shy sitting here in front of you, not really, but I could be, but why should that be a problem? I think what's difficult to accept, and this is a bit of a kind of what Carl Elliott, the writer, said, is called the looping effect. There's a technology going on, everybody thinks we should use the technology because our parents think, oh, my son has attention problems, so friends using, let's say, Ritalin to treat their children because of attention problems, so I should use it too. It's a kind of a rat race. And instead, what Michael Sandel said, instead of accepting what's called the given, the fact that you are born and you have a certain talent, develop that, instead of trying to get more out of you because of a kind of social drive to do so. And that's why I think, where is the ethics? I think that's a really important ethical issue. So what's the impact of these drugs on our functioning as a human individual, as a human person? Why should education just put emphasis only on performance and exams, while a lot of other issues are very important? The fact that you're sitting here together and discussing these things is much more important, but it's also important. And so why should drugs for every little big problem? But why should we show pressure to use all these technologies? I fully agree with the point you're raising. Very glad you did.
Thank you very much. And I can't resist adding that one of the reasons for new drugs is pharmaceutical companies have this idea of new disease areas, such as male pattern baldness. It's very difficult to sell drugs now because everyone else is producing the same drug and the advances are very small. So if you can't get new drugs for cancer or something like that, well, what you need is something like shyness, you see, and then you can make money. So there is a whole industry which is actually geared to producing new drugs. Lawrence, you had a point at the back.
Yeah, it was a sort of technical question and maybe with ethical implications as well. So without wishing in any way to defend Lance Armstrong, he obviously didn't just take a load of pills in the morning and then whiz up the mountain. He did put a lot of training in, like any Tour de France cyclist has to do. And some of the drugs he took would have a beneficial effect whether he'd not done the training. So like EPO, for instance, that would raise his blood's ability to carry oxygen, so that would be effective. But say steroids, for instance, is a different story. If you just take steroids and sit there, you're not going to get any better. They have a beneficial effect because they enhance your ability to train more effectively, to recover from training. So you have two different sorts of drugs in sport, some of which will just immediately enhance your performance. There was a chap, I've forgotten his name, who won the Tour de France while Lance Armstrong was retired. He'll come back to me in a minute. And he basically...
Floyd Landis.
Landis, that's it, Floyd Landis. And he won this miraculous stage of the Tour de France and was discovered later to have this incredibly raised testosterone level. And he basically slapped a testosterone patch on an intimate part of his anatomy before he went out that morning and basically whizzed off. So some drugs you can take and they will just enhance your performance regardless of training. And then you have other drugs like steroids, which you have to put the work in. I'm wondering, on a technical point, can we make a distinction in terms of intelligence, performance-enhancing drugs, cognitive enhancers? Can we make a distinction between those which you need to take while you're doing the work, putting work in, and those which are going to give you an immediate boost? And is an ethical distinction to be made there as well?
Okay, Stephen first, and then Ruud afterwards.
So it's a very good point, I think. I would point out, so even from a pathological point of view, when I was referring to the drug Zolpidem that was used in persistent vegetative state patients, I referred to Louis, who was in a coma. When he first was awoken by this 5 milligram dose of Zolpidem. He took it once in the morning, they gave it to him once in the morning, once in the afternoon, and that kept him awake. And now 10 years down the line, he takes his 1 dose in the morning and he never actually falls back into a persistent vegetative state at all. He's able to sleep well in the evening on 1 dose. And this is evidence, I think, to suggest that what's happened is that we've facilitated him to be able to function better during the day from the outset. And it's what the brain has done naturally in that state. So he's awake, so he's able to communicate, and in performing that communication, we have this, what we call plasticity, so the brain is able to develop new connections with other areas of the brain, be able to form its new connections for increased performance. And so eventually what's happened, I think, in this case, is that he's able to rely on that development that's happened over time with a lot of hard work and effort, no doubt, from him, his family, and probably therapists around him. And now he's in a state that he doesn't fall back into a persistent vegetative state. He's compensated to that degree. And so I think there probably is a distinction to be made between drugs, although the research, I don't think, is there, and whether it ever will be there, I don't know. But we can look at something like coffee, and we all feel that we've been given a bit of a boost, and we might work a bit better after a coffee that lasts for a short amount of time. Whether there's any lasting effects from my morning cappuccino or not, I'm not entirely sure. If I've done something particularly effective in that point, I'm not sure I remember it better or worse. So I don't have an answer to your question, but I think it's a very important point that it's facilitating the brain to do what it would do naturally that is providing these long-term effects. So I think there's a direct analogy between this and the Lance Armstrong and any other cyclist. I'm not sure whether I advocate it anymore because of that, but I think, yes, it's definitely worth pointing out that it's the effort that's been put on top of these drugs that have been used that's afforded these benefits.
Would you care to comment on these 2 different ways in which drugs can have an effect?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting distinction, actually. Though EPO, what EPO does is that, to come back to Armstrong, and now, don't forget, a lot of cyclists now confess, also, for example, in the Netherlands, a lot of Dutch cyclists confess they have used like EPO in the 1990s on the Rabo team. So it was widespread, and EPO, don't forget, EPO is a very dangerous treatment as well, because EPO leads to, it's used for people with kidney problems, but it can thicken the blood, so you can have coagulation problems. So all these drugs are very, very dangerous, and certainly EPO. That's why clinicians say you shouldn't use this outside medical therapy, only for medical purposes, but not outside. So, but that was not your question. The question is about should EPO. Well, what EPO does, it still is. It creates a different level, and even if you have, let's say, a powerful body like Armstrong probably had, because of course he was a great cyclist. But often it's forgotten that because of his cancer treatment, he got drugs that raised also his testosterone levels. So that is another issue like Landis had. So that's why even if it's a long-term effect, it still, let's say, has an impact on the competition in the sports. And well, maybe we should ask everybody to take EPO, but as I said, it's a very dangerous thing to do, and that's why I cannot. It's difficult to justify it, and also for the
Thank you very much. And yes, a point at the back there, please, right at the back.
Hi. Most of this discussion sort of about the ethics has been based on society enforcing or putting pressure on people to take these performance-enhancing or cognitive-enhancing drugs. But we haven't really had any sort of discussion about what if people want to take them, if in the future we do develop things that can enhance people's performance without getting them addicted and without causing negative health effects. Is there really a right for us to say, no, you can't have them, just because we say so, just because there's something not wrong with you, that you can't have it if it wouldn't have any problems?
We'll start with Ruud and then Steve.
Yeah, that's what I already mentioned. That's very difficult. at a certain point to say no. For example, think for example about a mobile phone. If you don't have a mobile phone, you're not part of the loop. And even if you don't have a smartphone nowadays, you see as a bit of a strange person. And using these drugs, if you don't use them, you are, let's say, ostracized. You're not part of society, and that's a dangerous effect. And it's that, of course, you can refuse to take them, but the pressure will be high, and it will, let's say, affect your own. That while they say you're promoting your autonomy, I say you're effectively going against your independence, your autonomy, because you are put in a very difficult position. And that's one of the problems of these technologies. It's become available, they're cheap and effective and useful, and safe. So why not take it? And that's a very difficult issue, and I'm very worried about it.
Do come back. Do you want to come back?
Yes, yeah, that's okay. I'm not sure you should necessarily be so worried that there is so much stigma. I mean, you use the example of mobile phones a lot, but I know people who don't necessarily have them or don't carry them all the time. Or I don't know that necessarily society is as pressurizing and determined that everyone should be uniform as you're portraying it to be. I'm just not sure there would be that level of pressure.
There is no clear pressure, no, but there is like a bit of idea, well, you are not a normal person, you don't have a mobile phone, or for example, I have a smartphone, I always forget to take it with me, so there's no, let's say, clear, external, clearly identifiable pressure. There is some kind of a hidden impact of these technologies to use them.
Could we perhaps work on how people think about each other and think about technology and society then, rather than inhibiting development?
No, I don't think we should inhibit development. I think there should be a wise and, let's say, use of them if they are, let's say, in a certain context. For example, used for therapeutic purposes is fine. If they're not used for therapeutic purposes, but let's say are used, let's say, to encourage much more competition in education, I think I'm not in favour of that. But I don't say we should not develop technology, because they can help people to deal with their own illnesses and problems.
Stephen, can you comment on this? Do come back to Stephen when he responds if you want to.
I mean, as somebody whose entire brain is uploaded into his smartphone, and whose smartphone has just died, I might make it back to my hotel a little later tonight. I think it's worthwhile making the distinction between what a drug can do and when you could use it. So what a smart drug in any form is not is a book in a pill. Okay, you can take this thing, but it doesn't mean that you've read the book that's contained within that pill. It comes back to the point that the gentleman was making before. If you're going to take one of these drugs, then there's a distinction between the sort of acute use, something which you would take now and get a quick buzz from, and something which you would then use to enhance your performance. So my point would be it would be very difficult to actually take a smart drug to go and take an exam, because you might be a bit smarter, you might be able to think around the question a bit better, but you're not going to know any of the information that you didn't know before you went into the exam. And so the question then remains, if you take a drug during the exam, would you then need to take a drug on a daily basis to be able to access that same information? So I don't think I have any particular problem with the idea of a smart drug. I mean, we could consider something like coffee to be a smart drug, because it enhances our alertness, and so makes us, we would argue, better able to function. I certainly function better after a cup of coffee, I think, anecdotal evidence. But we don't have any particular problem with coffee, do we? So extending that out, no, I don't think there's any particular ethical consideration, but I think it's all about the level playing field when you use these things, and understanding that within the pill is not contained. It's not like the program I was showing. It's not like Limitless, where you can take this thing and suddenly you actually are somebody that has read an entire library's worth of information. So that would be the point that I'd make.
Yes, at the front.
Okay, so this is a nice simple question. We're aware of all the different drugs in societies, the cultures that have been passed down. We're aware of where we come from, where we think we come from, the general consensus is that we are evolving, we've evolved. Are these drugs, technologies, benefiting us, helping us to evolve, or are they actually slowing us down and stopping us from evolving?
Stephen first, and then Ruud, okay?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Again, it comes down to this whole idea of cost and benefit. I think the answer is we don't know, because we don't know what the trade-off is. I mean, it comes back to some of the other questions where if we try and improve a child's performance in the classroom because we consider that they are being hyperactive, are we then going to impact on their creativity in a different, as a different aspect? So the short answer is that we don't know, and I would guess that we know why we've evolved in the past. I guess we could argue about whether the same mechanisms for evolution are in place. Survival of the fittest is obviously in a different format now than it ever has been in the past. So potentially, if there was some mechanism for selecting people based on IQ, which I'm sure there are, then we could be skewing it down that road. But I guess it comes down to the trade-off again. I'm sure Ruud's got.
Do you want to come back on that before I pass it over to?
I can do quickly. Just for example, Germany, as an instance, are actually embracing, for example, Asperger's and people with certain learning difficulties to utilise their numerical abilities to a higher standard, doing jobs that, say, the normal we can't actually do. So they're embracing that.
Stephen, could you perhaps comment on both those points raised?
Yes. Where do we come from? You say, well, are we let's say, is our life improving, getting better? I think since we are using the philosopher Charles Taylor said well, since 1600, when the technology was applied in society, in the role of engineers, etc., our daily life has improved significantly, particularly our everyday living, and medicine has made enormous contribution to a healthy life, to prevent early death in children, better treatment of infectious diseases, better living conditions. So we have improved enormously also by the use of technology. The problem with technology, it can put us in a kind of what Max Weber called an iron cage, that we are just caught into the reign of technology. We can't escape. And that's what we need to let's say, to prevent, let's say, to have discussions like we have tonight about should we really apply technology for such purposes. And I think that's one step too far, one bridge too far, that we use technology for things that can easily be done in other ways. And let's say the example you mentioned about people with Asperger's, that they can be offered a certain working, let's say, environment in which they can flourish, and we can have a happy life and happy working life. It's much more better than give them a pill to feed them. I think that's where technology goes too far, and I think that's where the ethical debate is. So how much technology do we want to use? Where do we want to use it? The kind of, let's say, appropriate use, and let's say, the intelligent and wise use of technology. And that's where the debate should be about.
Stephen, do you want to come back?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing to that, really, which is the studies that we've done where we're looking at whether we can very simply make somebody faster or slower when we do this brain stimulation technique. What we find is that there is a population of people that we can make faster, and there's a population that we can't. And there's good evidence to suggest there's a genetic basis to this. And so if we think about this in terms of drugs, then there's going to be a differential effect. It's going to work in some people and not in others. I mean, if you look at things like Ritalin, it will have an effect in one way in one person and an opposite, the absolute opposite in another person. And so this has a genetic basis to it. And if we're using these to enhance, then there's only a percentage of the population potentially that will be able to benefit from that. And so we are going down a genetically based line, and we know from prior experience of history that basing things on genetics is not a good thing. So I would point out that if we're selecting based on drugs, then we're also potentially selecting based on genetics.
Right, we have time for just one final more question, which is over. One final more question.
Sorry.
Yes, hi. So
I'm assuming that there will be a proportion of the population who won't be able to take these drugs because maybe they're on psychopharmaceuticals already for example, epilepsy or something like that, or maybe women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, they won't be able to take these drugs. So, first of all, is that assumption true? And is there any thought going to how they will be protected from any kind of discrimination?
Well,
No, this is for some point a technical issue. Probably Stephen can much better answer this in the effect of people's epilepsy in women who are pregnant. In the latter case, I presume that there are some bad effects, but I just can't answer that. So, have you seen?
Yeah, well, as with any medication, there's contraindications. If you're taking one medication, then you can't take another. So absolutely, potentially, if we were to identify one, then for any particular disorder, something like epilepsy, somebody may be affected by this in an adverse way, and the same as certainly with pregnancy and things like that. I mean, all of the drugs that we've mentioned here, they'll have a laundry list of things, other drugs that you shouldn't take this alongside, or times when you shouldn't take this, or disorders that you should avoid it with as well. So, yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you very much. Before we finish this evening, I'd just like to see what the audience thinks. I'd like to see a show of hands of those who feel that it's perfectly okay to take these mind-altering drugs. Show of hands of those who think it's perfectly okay. Now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 16. And those who think that it's not. 1, 2, 3, oh, it's very slightly in favour of those who think it's not, but it's certainly not, it's not absolutely one way or the other. I'd like to thank Stephen Hall and Ruud Meulen for their excellent contribution. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for your contribution. Thank you all for coming, and good night.